everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I am super excited that we are going to have a live panel session with some change management experts today on how organizations manage change. So let's jump right in here. I'm Madison Lundquist, the Principal Research Lead for the Process and Performance Management area, and then I also have my colleague Lynda Braksiek on the phone, and she is our Principal Research Lead for the Knowledge Management area. So we talk a lot about the integration of process and knowledge management, and I think change management is one that definitely crosses both areas. Now for our speakers today, I'm excited to have Cliff, Mel, and Scott on the phone today. And we asked for their bios and we got some fun responses, everything from Cliff loves pizza to Mel has kids and only has time for laundry and dishes in her spare time. And then Scott definitely has a passion for change management. Our speakers today do come from different backgrounds, different industries, and they are all in different roles. So I'm excited to have their expertise on the call today. Do you guys have anything before we jump into questions?
Excited for the conversation today. Let's get it going.
Thanks, Mel. And to our attendees today on the call, we do have some questions we're going to start with for each of the speakers, but I do encourage you to please add questions into the chat or the Q&A feature of Zoom. I'll be watching those and have a running list. That way, once we get through these sets of questions, we will open the floor for more. So I'm excited. Let's jump right in. So Scott, tell us a little bit about the foundational principles and frameworks that shape how you approach teaching, coaching, and doing change leadership and management.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I'll start with just a couple of points. I believe that based on my experience and learnings over the years, that all change starts within. If you don't go within, you go without. So I think we have to understand how change happens in ourselves in order to understand how it happens in other people. So I think that's sort of principle number one. I think number two, and it goes back to this intersection of knowledge management and process improvement, there is an art and a science to change management, and there's been an awful lot written and an awful lot of research and some really great things that have been developed over the years that I think people that are interested or in roles where they have to manage change need to manage their knowledge and skill sets. You need to be a continual learner, because there's a lot to learn about how to change ourselves, but also how to change others. So just for example, Peter Senge has written a wonderful book called The Dance of Change. He was the author of The Fifth Discipline. But The Dance of Change is, it's a sort of a field book, and you go through it, and it's got all kinds of tips and ideas and case studies and so forth. Chris Argyris is one of my favorite authors and researchers, talked about defensive routines. So when we talk about change, we know that resistance is a word that often crops up. So I think that Chris Argyris gives us insights around human beings and their defensive routines and why they occur and how they occur, and then how we can recognize them and start to be more conscious about them and start to break down those defensive routines. I think the third point I'd make is Jack Welch, who some of you may remember was CEO of GE, very well written and very well thought of as a leader. He said that all transformations, and so change to some extent is a transformation, whether it's at the individual, group, or organizational level. He said that change is all about energy management. That wasn't just because he was at GE. It was because, you've got to know when to infuse the right amount of energy, the right kind of energy, at the right spot at the right time. And so it really is, change management really is about managing different kinds of energy over time. So that's be the third thing that I would talk about. And then I think the fourth thing that as we were talking before the webinar started, in the world we live in today, AI and Industry 4.0 and technology innovation just in general, I mean, change is just being driven. It's like a Nike. It's, if you're on a football team, you don't do change management, you just change. If you're on the battlefield, you don't do change management, you just change. And I think in many organizations today, that it feels like that today. As GE transforms its assembly lines, I know that they do change management, but on the other hand, the pace of change is so rapid that people just sort of have to accept it and adopt it and adapt to it. So I think that's the sort of environment that we live in with respect to change management. Yes, we do it, but to some extent, the pace of change is so rapid today that if you don't just change, you're gonna get left behind. So I'll stop with those sort of 4 thoughts that are sort of underlying, I don't know, abstractions that guide me as I think about helping people and organizations manage the transformations and change.
Any comments for Scott before we move on? That was a lot. I loved it, Scott. I was writing down the names of the books and things I've read in the past that I've almost forgotten about. So it's good that reminder to go back and read some of those things. So somebody suggested putting together a book list as well, which I think would be super valuable. But anything else to add on this topic before we move on?
Scott, I appreciate you saying kind of do an interview of how do you process through change. How do you change before you can help others change? And I'm like, oh yeah, good point.
Yeah.
And you know it, but to really make a critical thought and maybe write it down or think about it more specifically, I'm like, that's huge. And sometimes I think that's what's forgotten is the human factor sometimes. And so we need to show that we're human too, and be able to show it and say, and even just be the first one to say, this is how I struggle with change. Like, hi, my name is Mel, and this is how, great thing. And so that kind of breaks down some of the barriers to start having these change communications. So I love that. That's a good reminder.
Yeah, and I think that the ability to reflect, to be reflective, in sprints, they do retrospectives. At the end of the week, you do a retrospective, right? It's a reflection. Yeah. And what that does is it calls people to a level of consciousness that left to their own devices, they might not get to. So if we can stay conscious about what's happening in the world around us, if we can stay conscious to our tendencies and other people's tendencies that are holding us back, that are causing us to perform at less than full potential, then I think we can start to dialogue about that and we can start to break those things down. So I think that the reflection and the consciousness issues is really critical for organizations. And that's sort of, part and parcel to quote learning organization that Senge talked a lot about.
I love that.
Yeah, Scott, as you were sharing, I was nodding my head a lot, but one of the things in particular was the degree to which change and the pace of change has really accelerated over time. Another book we can add to that reading list that we're keeping is Bill Passmore talking about navigating continuous change. And that idea of we like to think of it as having these neat linear phases, right? Like we are now starting to change. We are now navigating it. We are now done with it. But now it's continuous and it's complex, right? And organizations are navigating it at such a different rate. And so are the people who are in those organizations, right? So I do think that in particular resonates for me. And I think that's part of what makes it challenging to help people and help organizations be able to navigate it successfully.
Awesome. I love it. So with that, I'm going to segue to the next question because I think it's perfectly timed with what we just started to talk about for Mel. And we're going to ask her the question, Mel from Collins Aerospace, who happens to have, I think, several friends on the call today as I was looking through the participant list. So welcome to Collins Aerospace people. What should organizations consider when communicating change?
Time. We never have enough of it. We always push it too fast. We're always starting 6 months too late. I don't know. I think the biggest thing is time. There's 2 things. One is time is just give it as much time as you can. I don't think there's ever a time when it's too early because everyone changes differently. Everyone needs more time to be aware, to internalize what it's going to mean to them, to get up to speed with it, so I think time. The other thing I think is huge when it comes to communication is just like clothes, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all communication. If you're going to do it right, you need to have it in the right channel that fits whatever audience you're going to talk to. sent by the right sender and sent at the right time. So I think, make sure you have as long a time as possible to help people through the change curve, to help them adjust, to help them, let them react, give them time to react. Please give them time to react, so they can have that emotional time and then come back and be with you. And then when you do communicate it, make sure, don't send an email out to everybody if half your user base doesn't have access to personal email except once a month, once a week. I don't know, hypothetically, right? So if they need bulletin board written things, do that. Or if they need it to come in this one page channel, this is the know all be all for this department, then you do that. Make sure it comes in the form that they can receive it and from a sender that they trust, listen to, and know it provides action, and give them some time. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think that just to add to that, Mel, John Cotter wrote a really good article in Harvard Business Review a number of years ago, 8 reasons why transformation efforts fail. So, I mean, we could change transformation to just change, right? 8 reasons why change fails. And one of the 8 factors was under communicating by a factor of 10, right?
Yeah.
So you can't communicate enough. And to your point, you have to, again, communication is an energy infusion, like Jack Welch said. So you got to know, when to infuse that communication energy over time, and to sort of maintain a continuity of people being connected to what's happening and understanding what's happening.
Well, and don't you guys think the tone is so important in the communications as well, that when you're first announcing it, understand there might be some backlash, or there might be some fear, or there might be some big frustration, right? So acknowledge it. Or say, you might not know what this means, but acknowledge it. Don't come out like cheerleading right away. This is going to be great, because it might not be great for everybody, and let people have that. I mean, Cliff, what do you think? I think the tone is good to be aware, so that you don't railroad people, level set people, like, this is going to be great, when it might be the worst thing they've heard today.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of why understanding your users, right? Like, in my case, doing internal communications, your staff, or whatever the broader organization is you're trying to shepherd through this, is really important, right? Now, because otherwise it's hard to know what that tone is, because you don't understand where folks are at. So it does take like a constant dialogue and relationship to understand the space or the system that you're existing in, and the change that you're trying to shepherd through. I have seen both messages that have gone too sunny in an attempt to be like, yay, and people are like, whoa, this is a lot to deal with. And also I've seen it go the other direction, where it's like, we're apologizing for a thing that's actually can be really exciting and has a lot of potential. And so you can really easily swing too far in either direction without an understanding of where folks are at.
Great point, Cliff. And that actually leads us into the question that we had for you, that elaborates a little bit more on communication. But as someone who thinks specifically about communicating through change, how do you distinguish between a change management plan and a communications plan? And how do you even get started with that?
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that we're even delineating between the two, because my experience has been oftentimes I get pulled in as a person who does internal communications, and it's like, we need a change management plan. And we're oftentimes referring to it almost synonymously with comms plan. Like, you'll see them used interchangeably in some environments as though they're the exact same thing, right? And yet the reality is, we need to be truly supporting people through a change process, right? From the current state of where they're at to the future state of where we're going, and whatever that thing is. And that's about more than just getting a message out. But I do think sometimes the tendency is, if we just communicate the thing, right, and communicate it frequently and in the right way, surely everybody will be ready to go, right? That's all we need to do. We just need to do it centrally. If we do it the right way, we're good. So I do like to delineate between the two. And then in the planning process, I mentioned that user experience piece. I like to start with the people who are going to be experiencing said change that need to be supported, and really ask the question, what are we hoping they do? What do they need to feel to be able to do that? And what do they need to know to be able to get to that stage? So you saw that know, feel, do I put in my bio. That's where that comes from, right? And I think it's a critical lens to be able to apply in a adult learning environment, but I also think it's really important for communication. I always start with that know, feel, do. And that allows us to really ground deeply in who are the people who are going to have to navigate this change. And sometimes you might have multiple know, feel, do's, because you might have different audiences within that group. And if you really ground deeply in that, it helps you get clear on the objective. And then you start to distinguish between, well, some of these things are comms things, and some of these things are actually other kinds of supports we're going to need to be able to provide. And we're going to have to think about this more broadly than just what messages do we need to get out. So a lot of times I like to ground in that no feel do, helps us get really clear on the user that is going to be going through that change process, and then build not just your comms plan, but your broader holistic change plan from that.
There was a great question that just got thrown in the chat, and I also have one kind of similar to it as
Yeah.
well. But how about over communicating? How do you deal with that? You know, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of changes sometimes happening at the same time, and then suddenly you're competing for attention. So how do you deal with that?
I love this question. I'll be curious what Mel and Scott think too. My take is, in terms of the communications that you're doing, right? You have an ecosystem of a bunch of different channels. Mel mentioned that earlier, right? Like there's a lot of different ways that people are navigating things, and every organization is set up slightly differently in terms of how they maximize those channels, how everybody's being expected to go about consuming information. And that can really change the way that you think about what over communicating is, because you could be drowning people in messaging. It could be that they're sitting out there going, please just tell me something, because I'm hearing nothing whatsoever. And the organizational climate can really vary. In our organization, we have a few main communication channels we're using. We're an organization that was really heavy on email, but then introduced Slack at a certain point. And so we still have both of those in existence, but slightly distinct. We obviously have an intranet that we maintain as well. That's a key channel. You've got lots of all staff spaces and events that are happening, and then tons of different team channels that are going on as well. And the feedback that we've gotten from our staff generally is not that they don't hear enough. It's that they have a hard time sifting through the amount of information that they're getting from all of those different places. So we've worked really hard to try to distinguish what those different channels are and give people some choice and agency in terms of how they navigate it, but also set it up so that they're not getting bombarded and essentially spammed with the same message over and over and over again. But that wasn't just a part of one single change plan, right? That was about how do we create the ecosystem for our comms overall. And then hopefully that communication and change plan exists within that. But yeah, that over communication thing is real, especially when you've got tons of those different complex changes happening all at the same time.
There
Mel
was
and Scott, what would you add? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll chime in real quick. We did a case study on an organization, and there was a question in the Q&A asking about how do you make those communications stand out a little bit more? So yes, people are inundated, but how do you make sure that that specific communication gets the attention it deserves? And this organization branded their large change initiatives and had a logo that went with that project. So if someone saw an email come in, they could see this small little logo that said, oh, this is about project X, and then this one's about project Y. So yes, they may be getting 100 emails, but at least they know when they open that and see the logo, they know that it's about this specific topic. So they could flag it for later, they could read it then. It just gives them a little bit more guidance on what they're about to hear or read. All right, Lynda, I think I may pass it off to you.
Sure, we're gonna,
Unless,
Scott, did you want to say something, Scott, before we moved on?
Well, I was going to say, you know, this is it's an interesting question, an interesting area that I think is challenging for organizations. But when I was listening to Cliff talk about, you know, his approach to this, I was thinking about tiered huddle systems. Emory Healthcare, for example, has a tiered huddle system where they've got tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So every day they have a huddle. So for example, a cardiac unit would huddle around a huddle board. It's like in the context of lean, right? And so they'd huddle around this board and they would talk about, you know, what's ahead of us today, who's here today. It means simple things like who's here today, you know, what are we up against today, what equipment's up, what equipment's down. And then one person from each of those huddles goes to the tier 2 huddles, which is a collection of tier 1 huddles. And it just keeps going until they get to level 5. Once they get to level 5, there's 60 people in a room, and it's basically a representative from every major facility and unit in the healthcare system in Atlanta. And they do that every day. And so there's continuous improvement it's almost like it's run in the business. So there's run in the business conversations, but there's also improving the business conversations that are happening concurrently. So think about how much communication, how much is shared every day in a very sort of pretty structured way, but people get engaged and they get involved. So I think we're seeing more of that kind of a system emerge. Now it's going to play out different in different types of facilities, right? So different types of, if you're virtual, then you're going to probably use a Miro board, right? And so you're going to be huddling around a Miro board and instead of a whiteboard, right? It's a physical huddle. But so that's something that I've seen that I thought addressed this issue of how do we sort of focus the conversations and structure how we communicate what's happening and so forth. Yeah.
Well, and I want to see everyone's reactions here, but just like there's no one size fits all in communication, there's not a one and done, right? What is it? Adult, it takes 7 times to hear before you learn something or whatever, so it's a matter of, repeating it where it needs to be, or having it said by somebody or if they're like, well, okay, I've heard about this in 4 channels or 4 different people, it must be serious, or it must be something I need to listen to. So there's some value in redundancy as well as picking the right channels and people, but to say, you are going to hear about it a few times, and because of the granularity of it or the grandness of it, or how can you communicate as close to where the action needs to happen as possible too, so it's not just a huge jump to a system or a location or something like that. So yeah, tons about communication.
Yeah, Mel, that makes me think about the Scott used the healthcare example, right? And you had talked earlier about sending something out when people are not at their desk. I worked once with a hospital where they were trying to communicate out with video messages. And yet the reality was most of the people that were in the hospital were not sitting at desks. And if they were sitting at desks, there weren't computer speakers, so they couldn't hear the sound. So like the channel just wasn't lining up, right? And so I do think the system that you're in is going to vary in terms of how much of that saturation is happening, because you might think people are hearing it 4 or 5 times. They might not be. You also might think that they're not getting inundated, and it turns out they have been, because it all depends on how those channels have actually played out in the daily experience of your staff.
This is such a good topic. I had a boss that used to say to me, Lynda, 7 to 10 times it takes for it to really soak in with somebody. And I'd be like, what? I can't communicate this again, really? But it is so true. It's that redundant, because somebody could be on vacation. They're just not paying attention that day. They're just too busy, whatever. So you got to catch them at the right moment. So, okay. Now, in the interest of time, and we have so many amazing questions to ask these amazing people, I'm going to switch gears a little bit on the next question, and we're going to direct this one at Mel. And this is a good one. Let's talk about the intertwining of disciplines that sometimes we see as separate, but how they work together. So how do you see project management, change, and knowledge management? How do they work together? How do they relate to each other?
This has become a personal soapbox topic for me, so welcome. I call these the management triad. I say you cannot have a successful project without change management, knowledge management, and project management. You cannot. Okay, it's like the good, cheap, easy. Pick 2. Kind of thing. You're gonna lose something without the other, right? So I have a cheat sheet up here because I made a whole image on it. I should have sent that to you ahead of time, but I think about knowledge management, intentionally understanding the data or knowledge gaps with the process or project, what needs to go through. Project management is, of course, a structured approach to ensure the project is delivered on time, within budget, according to standards, whereas the change management focuses on helping the individuals or teams prepare and adapt to what's going to happen. So we have the data, we have what needs to happen, and who it needs to happen with. You have to have all 3 to equal success. Period.
Yeah.
Does it look different? Sure. But I think you have to have all 3, and you have to respect all 3 in their different lanes, roles, responsibilities, and the value that they bring to a project.
Yeah, I think I agree, Mel. Bill Morris was my PhD advisor at Ohio State, and he wrote a book called Implementation Strategies for Industrial Engineers. Because industrial engineers, the profession itself is by definition changing things, right? Making processes better. And so he said we have a 3-ball problem. And so it's going to reinforce what you just said, Mel. So number 1 is solve the focal problem, which is knowledge management. You got to know what solution to bring to the problem, right? Number 2, is the project management piece. So you got to manage the resources required to get the project completed. And then number 3 is you got to get people to buy into the solution, right? So you have to get acceptance of the solution. So, and a change manager, a solution manager has to really keep those 3 balls juggling in order to be successful and get the benefits realized that they're starting out to do. So I 100% agree with what you said, Mel. You got to have all 3 of them. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Cliff, anything?
I think they said it so well, Maddie. I'm good.
They did. Maybe the concept of these 3 things, I think everybody kind of understands, but I think it's the application of these 3 things within the organizations that can prove to be the greater challenge. So maybe I'll even ask a little bit further, is this structured in a way in your organizations where this is easy to do, difficult to do? Do they actually, are they co-located in teams, or is it about kind of collaborating and stretching across the organization to make sure it happens?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to add on, Lynda, is to say the challenge in this is really to explain to leadership and management that it really needs to be 3 different people. You can't wear 3 hats on one head. You know, I mean, we all change hats a million times. I mean, I literally have meetings. I'm like, okay, who am I in this meeting? Oh, I'm not that person. I'm this person now. You know, I almost need to like mentally think, but you really need this to be 3 separate people. Now, I personally don't care if they're all on the same team, as long as they know what hat they're wearing. If they come from that, I don't care, because it provides value both ways. But I see often that, like Cliff said before, well, I'm the change and comm person. Yeah, really, to do it right and have, you know, your checks and balances, they should be very tightly coupled, but they should be different, right? Same with project management, knowledge management, change management. I think you do an injustice to the project if you try and make someone do multiple roles within those categories.
Yeah. And Mel, to add to that, I think that behaviorally, there's also a behavioral dimension. So, you know, if someone's going to facilitate change, they have to be almost a chameleon. They have to have style flexibility. So at times, somebody needs to be able to be a challenger, to challenge people or to challenge a group. Sometimes they need to just be an acceptant listener. Just sit back and listen, right? Let people talk, give people room. Sometimes they have to be an opinion seeker or an opinion giver. Sometimes they've got to be a knowledge provider. So they've got to be a solution provider. They got to jump in and so again, if you've got somebody that's a good project manager, but doesn't really understand the solutions, then to your point, Mel, you've got somebody that can manage projects, but really doesn't know how to solve the problem.
I think we need a minor in psychology for change management. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
Emotional intelligence, you know,
I have a master's degree in I have a master's degree in social work, Mel, so that comes in handy sometimes too.
That's good.
I will say, Mel, to your point, one of the things that you might encounter, depending on who you are in the space, right? I know we've got a bunch of attendees out there, is you might feel like, well, I'm at a small organization. Like we don't specialize in that same way, right? I still think, to your point, it's possible to go into a project and say, we know we have these different areas that we need to cover in order to be successful. Obviously, we've got a smaller team or a smaller organization, and we might have to wear multiple hats, but let's make sure someone distinctly is thinking about each of these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that person's full-time job is that one thing, because we can't all specialize in that way. But I still think you're right that those distinctions are important versus just lumping them all together as a way to get through that.
I mean, I literally have peers. They're like, that's great, but you're here as the change person in this project. And I'm like, oh, that's right. I'm not knowledge with this one. Okay. You know, I mean, you have your trusted peers. They'll be like, that's cool, but that's not your role in this project. I'm like, thank you for the reminder. You're right.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Love that. All right, Maddie, you're up.
Great points. So you talked about being a chameleon, Scott, but how else would you counsel someone wanting to improve their knowledge and skills in relationship to change leadership and management?
Well, we've nibbled at that a little bit in our conversations. I think that you know, there are great industrial psychology departments in major universities around the country that have, you know, industrial psychology 101, 201, and 301. But, you know, I think there's just tons of great references out there on the Internet of Things that are available to people. So goes back to knowledge management. I think if you're really interested in this and you really want to make that kind of a contribution to the world and to organization you live in and work in, I think investing in your knowledge base and starting to practice and develop your skills, creating a personal and professional plan of study and development that moves you in the direction of being smarter about what is change management all about. I mean, getting a copy of Dance of Change and read through it and study it, right? And then start to practice it. So I think it's in the world we live in today, you've got so many resources at your fingertips that we can really self-educate to some extent if we're motivated and if we have a plan. Now the challenge is that you've got to be the student and the professor. You don't have somebody giving you the syllabus. You've got to create the syllabus. So you got to do a little bit of homework and be smart enough to understand what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff. Separate the chaff from the wheat, so to speak. Yeah. So I think that's what I would say. And attending things like this, you just soak it up, be a sponge. There's tremendous opportunities out there. So I'll stop there and let Mel and Cliff jump in on this one.
Yeah, I was thinking less about formal opportunities like a webinar, Scott, and more the informal ones day to day, right? Like what are the chances you have to get more proximate to folks who are practitioners in this area, or, when you're watching a project and going, I'd really like to better understand this, have a conversation with somebody, because there are times where it can be formal, reading a book, grounding in a framework. But to your point, sometimes it's going to be being a sponge, right? And asking the right questions and trying to find a space.
I think we also have a professional responsibility that if we have this knowledge, this skill, this experience, and we glean it on people, right? We share it with people. We also label it and say, that's part of my experience in this, or I learned from this book, or I learned from this certification. I really recommend it. I think we really do have a professional responsibility to help people help themselves too, beyond just because as much as I love to be like, oh my gosh, go talk to Mel, she'll help you. I want to teach everybody to get to that foundational level so I can keep working on the harder things, right? And so I think when it comes to some of these disciplines that may be a little newer, maybe a little touchier, or something like that, that we do our best, if we are given the opportunity to have a soapbox or a seat at the table, to also share, we're talking about change management right now. There really is a discipline about this. There really is documentation about this. If you're interested in learning any of it, I will share my books or my resource list. That's why I think these resource lists are so great, to be like, yeah, I have that. Here you go. So it's helping put a name to it so they can do a keyword search later if they're not comfortable asking you a question directly to your face or in the room.
I think as we're talking about this topic in advancing your knowledge of yourself, it reminds me that I don't think we've talked about them yet, but change readiness assessment. So you're talking about improving the knowledge of yourself, but then how do you learn about the people you are trying to get to change too? Because you have to understand what's going to motivate them, how you're going to communicate with them, all that stuff that's super important. So you don't only have to make yourself smarter in change management, but also how to change the mind of the other people too. So
I love the concept of the change leadership component. I just wanted to add that one of the things that I know that I started to do through my career was when I saw good leadership, I made a point to remember what that person did, how they showed up every day, what they said, how they reacted to people who were resisting or who were having trouble with the change, and how they responded to that, right? And having those good examples of leadership in your organization is also a great way to help other people. Watch this person when they're in a meeting, watch this person throughout this project, go to them for mentoring. A lot of people have some of that very naturally, or they've honed those skills over time and they're exceptional at it. So I'm always on the lookout to look for those people that just have those skills, that you just see it, they're assessing the people in the room. They're trying to figure out, where's the resistance coming from? How am I going to react to this? How do I help this person without leaving this person behind? Things like that. So I think the observation of great change leadership is just another way you can educate yourself. Just pay attention, listen, learn, right? Do those things. So that was one thing that helped me, be quiet, Lynda, and listen to others who do this well, and you will learn something,
Which
so.
I think in our hybrid work environment, there's never one size fits all. There's never a perfect scenario. But I think when you're physically in the room with people, you can get a lot more nonverbals, right? You can get body language, stuff like that. Now, I greatly value web meetings that have cameras on, because I can still get facial. Do not ever, well, you might want me to play poker with you because I have zero poker face, right? But there's pros and cons. Now, what I love about virtual meetings is everyone has equal opportunity to talk, to have a voice. That kind of gets muddied in a hybrid situation with people in the room versus people on the phone. So really think about the environment you're in and what kind of feedback or what kind of observations you're looking for, so maybe you can right size where and how that communication happens too. Or if you're with someone who English is their not first language, maybe they need time to think about their response and you need to put it in writing.
Yep.
That's
a really good point too, Mel, with the global workforce the way it is today. That's a really good point. So, okay, so now that I've got Mel's attention, we're gonna flip to the next
okay.
question.
No, I thought somebody came off of mute, but go ahead.
Sorry.
I don't know. No,
It was me. Me.
Okay.
I was going to say, I think that's something that we haven't touched on much, is the hybrid environment, and really thinking about how do you want this communication to go out? Do you want it to be a fully hybrid meeting where everybody is remote so that, like you said, there's equal opportunity? Or does it need to be in person? And if it does need to be in person, if it is a hybrid environment, there may be people that are upset that they have to come in. And so how are you going to negate that issue to then communicate the change? So there's a lot more to consider now when we're looking at hybrid versus in office communication.
And I think hybrid can be done very well. It takes a lot more active management.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, some of us just don't have the option of pulling people together because of budget constraints or practical constraints, right? Like the reality is I work in a nonprofit that is spread across all over the place, all the way to Hawaii, right? So we've got people that are spread across the country, and yet we don't have the budget most of the time to be like, hey, it's a big thing, let's get everybody together. And so those constraints are naturally placed on us, and we just have to think about it differently. And I also think one of the things that we think about in that synchronous versus asynchronous communication, this last spring, we went through some pretty major changes as an organization structurally. And as we were going through that, we made a conscious choice. We're going to lean into asynchronous right now. And the reason we're going to do that is because every time we do something live, there's going to be somebody that misses it. And in this particular moment for us, we need to have as much as possible that is available to people in a one-stop shop they can go to when they're ready to consume it. And so, yeah, we have to make those choices sometimes, not because of what we'd prefer to do. Like I would have loved to fly everybody into one place and just have them on site. But that just wasn't an option. So we had to adjust.
That's a good point. I like considering the hybrid or remote kind of option as we think about this too. So with that being said, I'm going to move to another question. This one is directed at Mel. And this kind of starts to speak to what you were talking about before, Mel, with the organization. So if you could pick 2 pieces of advice to provide to organizations who are embarking on change, what would those be?
One thing I've seen done well and one thing I've seen never done well. One, if you have a really clear, engaged, passionate sponsor, someone who's going to be there and go through the good times, the bad, everything with you. I mean, I don't care what level of the organization, whatever the right level for this, your change is, to really have one to say, I'm going to coach you to be the sponsor. You're going to be the face. You're going to be the voice. You're going to, it's huge. If you have a very clear sponsor and a very clear message and stuff, it's just helps so much. Because an email from Mel Dahm means nothing in my organization. And an email from VP so-and-so, all of a sudden like, whoa, why am I getting an email from a VP? Kind of thing. So that goes with that trust and center. The other thing that I've alluded to already that is never done well enough is enough time. That I just don't think, here's the point that I would say a lot. We don't give people enough time to react, get through their feelings before they get to the logical part, right? Quite often, once we have a change, whoever's implementing the change has been talking about it for 2 months to 2 years already, and they already had their closed door conversations of, you gotta be kidding me, right? You know how this is gonna happen, right? Oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? They've had their freak out moment. They've worked through it. They got to do it behind closed doors. They went down. They're like, this is gonna kill us. What are we gonna do? And then they're like, oh, and they're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. They got there. Well, they're announcing this change after they've gone through that. Give people grace and time to do that themselves. Give them the resources to understand, why do you think this is going to get there? Tell them what you considered that isn't going to be a good option and why you consider it. Let them feel like they're part of this, because quite often we're like, this is what you're doing, this is what you're going to start doing, and here's the date, and you need to do it. That doesn't feel good to anybody, ever. Give them time. Let them be human and have their emotions, get through their emotions, and then come back to logic.
Yeah. And yet, Mel, it's probably one of the hardest things to do because of the runway it takes, right? Like, I completely agree. And so, like, the odds are you're probably never going to get the amount of time you'd like to have, but that constant orientation of how much longer can I push it? How much more time can we give ourselves is always a question to be asking, for sure.
My and to that, what Mel said, and this is, I think, make it a pull instead of a push. So Senge talked about shared vision. I think whenever you can create a shared vision that everybody buys into and is connected to, it just makes change so much easier, because then you've got alignment, you've got attunement, and we're all, use Minnesota Gophers, we're all rowing a boat together, right? The head coach likes to talk about rowing a boat, and so I think if you can do that, it doesn't make any difference whether it's for you individually. So back to the question about how do I, get better at change management. If you have a vision of what you want to be, and when I went to Peter Senge's 3-day course, we spent 3 times a day. We sat in groups of 2 or 3, and we just answered one question: what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? And I got so tired of answering that question. But at the end of 3 days, I was pretty doggone clear about what I wanted. And so the notion is that Robert Fritz, who was a major author in the 5th discipline, talks about the creation process versus the problem solving process. So problem solving is making something go away that you have and don't want. Creation is bringing something into being that you want and don't have. Creation is far more powerful than problem solving. So if you can get people into the creation process and that mindset, you can move mountains.
I need you to email me that, because I really need to think on that. That was huge. That was awesome. But along your lines there, you said, I like to also connect it to, usually every change, organization is because of feedback that they've received from their employees, or because of the state of the business is changing. Yeah. You want more job security. Okay, well, that means we need to get this product out the door faster. Okay, that means we need a better supplier base. We can do it. Okay, you asked that. These are the steps we're doing to get to what you asked for. So if you can help put that puzzle piece together for them to be like, guys, this is going to help us have less variability in XYZ, or this is going to help your systems respond better, because I know you're not going to be in your own little homegrown system. We're going to go to a bigger one, but then that's how it's going to be more responsive, and you're going to be able to talk to these other sites better and stuff. You have to give that bigger picture of saying, we are listening to you. We are answering what you wanted. You just might not have known this is the road we were going to take to get there.
Yeah, that's it. You're exactly right. Yeah, 100%.
I do want that nugget that you shared before, though. Somebody got it. You have to type it out. I got to think about that more. It kind of exploded my brain a little bit.
I was just typing in the chat, Mel, because I was thinking the same thing. We've had some really great references and some really great profound statements. And we do write up overview articles of these webinars now for everyone. So not only will you get the recording, but we'll make sure that there's a nice kind of article summary of everything. And we look through all of the transcripts of the chat and the webinar itself. I think it produces a really good piece of information that you can refer back to and say, wow, look at me. I was really smart when I said that in this webinar.
I'll be like, what did Scott say? I'm going to use that.
Exactly. What is Scott? Yeah, exactly.
I'll sound smart next time.
Yeah. It's your turn next time, Cliff.
It is your turn, Cliff.
I think it is your turn.
So I know we're getting through a lot of questions. So we have 2 more questions that we have on the list, and then we've got some coming in from the participants as well. So I'm going to move on to this next question. And Cliff, this one's on the screen for you, but I'm going to read it out. And then I also have one from the Q&A portal thing that I want to have you address at the same time. So what's a common pitfall you see when an organization's leadership is thinking about how to communicate during and through the change? And one of the participants was wanting to know, how do you mitigate that panic from leadership or the project team when you let people freak out? It could display as resistance to the change. So how do you handle that?
Yeah. I'll tackle the first part first that's up on the screen, right?
Yeah.
In terms of common pitfalls, this is actually not just unique to change moments, but my experience is we all think that if we communicate in the coolest, fanciest, newest way, that will take care of all of the other issues that we have at play, right? Like, no, Cliff, this time we're not going to put it in the newsletter. We're actually going to live blog it from, and it's like, it's not just about the channel, right? I know those new shiny ideas are tempting, and you'd like to think that if we try that thing, it's gonna get through the audience so much more effectively. And that's not always the case. So if your staff have told you universally, like they have at our organization, could you just put everything in one place in our weekly newsletter so I don't have to like look around in all the places for it? Like, I just want to make sure it's there. And you're like, no, we're going to create this new place over here. You're actually swimming completely against what your staff need in terms of being able to find it, right? And it might feel boring to use that thing that everybody uses already, but guess what? They know where to go for it and how to use it already, right? So there are advantages to sticking with some of those tried and true things. So that's one pitfall I've seen. The second question, Madison, was more about like, how do you control the freak out moment? I'd welcome in Mel and Scott on that one. I do think part of it comes back to the time thing Mel talked about. The time allows you also to work with folks to understand, hey, this is the process we're all going to navigate and the phases we're all going to move through and some of the things that people are going to experience. So you actually can prep people for what to expect. Because I do think there's a little bit less panic if you know, oh, right, this is just naturally human experience and everybody's going to have this kind of a moment, no matter how we do it or when we do it. Hopefully dials it down a little bit. Mel, Scott, what would you add in?
Scott, do you have anything?
Yeah, I guess what I would do, Cliff, is just say that, when I think about when I work with organizations where they're trying to do a major transformation, 2-3 years in, I ask them to think about what I call fronts. In other words, like, and I'm going to use a war metaphor, which is probably not a good metaphor to use right now, but you've got fronts, and the point about fronts is if a front gets too far out ahead of another front, then that's bad because you can get in behind a front. If a front lags behind, then that's bad because you can infiltrate that gap. So the notion is that you've got these fronts in change and transformation, large scale transformations. And you've got the planning front, you've got the technology front, you've got the motivation front, and you've got a communication front. So somebody needs to own the communication front and make sure that communication is staying aligned with the other fronts. And I think so often that isn't done, or communication isn't sort of owned by one person. And so communication sort of gets to become a very confusing strategy. And one person's doing it this way, using a whole bunch of different kinds of challenge, and it gets to be not a very well thought through front, so to speak. So I think that for me, it's making sure that people understand that communication has to be planned and thought through and executed in a disciplined fashion, just like you would do with technology. So if you're going to do AI, we're going to roll out AI. You've got a very disciplined strategy that you're going to do that. Same thing with communication. So we're going to roll out AI. How are we going to communicate with people so they understand what are the implications? What are the risks? What are we doing to mitigate the risk? All those kinds of things have to happen. So I think that's the thing for me, Cliff, is that sometimes we don't manage communication the way we manage other things. And that's a mistake, I think, on people's part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to build on that, I seriously come to some of these webinars as a form of counseling and feel seen. You know, so, because I want to acknowledge, you know, there was a chat about it, but unfortunately, these are the roles, the departments that are either a nice to have versus a must have, are the ones that get cut pretty fast when the times get tough. And it's so unfortunate. I've not had to make those no-go decisions on someone losing a job. I hope I never have to, but I want to honor that in this group, because I feel like I don't want to paint this sunny picture that we got this figured out at my organization. Are you kidding me? No. But I have hope that if we keep educating more people about it and the value for it, and that there's humans behind everything that we do, and it's okay to have logic and emotion in the workplace, and it's okay, you know, if we can value input from other sides of the world, they may be brilliant, you know, we hire smart people, let's let them be smart. I mean, all these just little taglines, whatever you want. I have hope that we'll continue to make progress with those organizations who listen. And if nothing else, we can continue to arm people with a vocabulary, a mind frame that can help individuals here and there. So I just want to honor that out there. That I hear you, I feel it. We've gone through a lot of cuts. I mean, I always wonder, you know, is my job secure? You know, kind of thing. So I hear you, but I also know that in my heart of hearts, my gut, this is the right thing to do. And I won't stop fighting for that.
Thanks, Mel. We have one more question from the participants that I want to get to while we're on the topic of communication, and then we'll switch to one more closing statement from each of our panelists, and then we'll close out the webinar. So the question is, specifically, what strategies and tools does the organization use, or should they use, to communicate financial changes to employees and stakeholders effectively? But I would almost say that financial could be replaced with sensitive or like, how do you handle those more sensitive topics when you're communicating that change?
On the finance front, I mean, I can offer a little bit from our perspective. I think at an organization, again, nonprofit context, right? Tight budgets. And we've had changes in the past that have led to jobs being eliminated, right? And organizations shrinking, kind of like you were talking about, Mel. And as a result of that, anytime we talk about how we're doing on fundraising or budget, everybody's ears perk up. And immediately we are in a like heightened state of anxiety of like, oh geez, what's the news, right? What's going on?
Yeah.
How are we doing? It's a natural reaction. So I think part of that is we've got to be in a regular rhythm of communicating about our finances, as opposed to thinking that we can do it, I don't know, once or twice a year, we'll check in and tell people what's going on, right? We haven't built the muscle for people to actually understand anything. And so you have to have this massive conversation every time we talk about finances, because we got to explain about 50 different terms and all these different things that most of us are not swimming in every day, right? And then secondly, we haven't talked about it in months. So we got to catch up on all the things that have happening. You know, actually, it was looking really good, and then it wasn't, and then it was again. And so that you're covering so much information in that moment. So I think that regular rhythm is critical, and actually building the capacity and building the muscle for people to be able to have the conversation. And I think that applies across not just finance, but other areas too, Maddie, because there's so many things that we're trying to communicate about that if we try to do it infrequently are going to be so much more challenging than if we keep people regularly updated. So those are some of my thoughts.
You know, you're right. Like the language of finance, not my vocabulary, not something I really want to add to my vocabulary, if I'm going to be very honest, right? But what if we could just have words hyperlinked that can go to the organization definition of what that is? You know, if I put on my knowledge management hat a little bit to say, how easy would that be? We could have a glossary of terms. How great would that be for new hires and onboarding, you know, stuff like that. And to say, hey, if you're not quite sure what that means in this context, click it, we'll go to this glossary term, or just, I don't care if it's one link at the top or to our FAQs, you know, or something like that. But to say, help those that want to learn more though, right? To make sure they are on the same page as you, because if I go to Google, it may be a completely different definition of what it is in my organization. Or my goodness, we have we have multiple SBUs within our same company. Kid you not, same acronym can mean like 2-3 different things depending on what SBU you're at, you know? So it's like, we need to arm our people with that knowledge. And if they don't know who to go to or where to go, you know, so maybe help them understand better that way.
Great point. We're getting close to time, so I am going to give you guys each about 30 seconds, which is, I know, way less than you guys probably need. But what is an aha moment you can share that highlights some important aspect of change leadership and management? Or maybe it's something you've said today that you just want to reiterate before everybody hops off. And we will start with Scott, if that works, and then go through our panel.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I'm not going to repeat something I said. I'll share something different. I think the power of visibility, the power of visible measurement systems is really important in change management. In any number of assignments that I've had, just improving the visibility and transparency for how people are doing, how teams are doing, drove significant improvement. So, and I'm sort of saying that improvement, I mean, by definition, improvement requires somebody to do something different, right? So it's sort of change in a sense. So visible measurement systems are a change management tool in a sense. And we know from job characteristics theory that there's 5 core job dimensions, and knowledge of results is one of them. And so I think giving people some understanding of how am I doing, how are we doing, in the context of some specs, some requirements by some customers, quote customer. So I think that would be, for me, that's sort of an aha moment. And it's surprising how many organizations don't tap into that.
Great point. Cliff, I'll let you have the floor now.
Yeah, aha moment. I had a chief people officer who reminded me in a moment of a bunch of change where she was getting just tons of input and feedback from all over the place, right? As people were experiencing this change, that a lot of times you don't need to quote unquote solve for every piece of feedback or emotion someone's having. Sometimes you just need to acknowledge it and be present to it, right? And that was a great illustration for me of the importance of being human. There are going to be lots of experiences of these moments of change. That doesn't mean you need to swing in and have an FAQ for every single one of them. Sometimes it's just, thank you so much for naming that. That is real. Done, right? Like sometimes it can just be acknowledging. So yeah, for me, that was an aha moment in terms of being human and what that looks like.
That's a great point.
Top of the hour, I'll be quick. We have the absolute privilege within this discipline to remind for-profit, non-for-profit companies that they rely on humans. See the human in your company.
Love it. Thank you, Mel, Scott, and Cliff. Y'all had great insights throughout the entire panel discussion, and I am so thankful you guys were here. We, as Lynda mentioned, will do a write-up of today's webinar, and we'll share that out with all of the registrants. We'll publish it in the resource library. We have a ton of research on change management, so be sure to check that out. And then we are closing out the year with a lot of activities in KM and PPM, so be sure to check the events page and join us on future webinars and roundtables as well. And then you will get a copy of the slides and the recording within a couple business days via email, so make sure you watch your email for that. And don't forget to let us know what you thought about the session via our quick survey. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar. A special thanks again to Scott, Cliff, and Mel for providing all of your insights, and Lynda for helping me facilitate. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of y'all's day. Bye-bye.
Thanks again.